Welcome friends to the Secret Doctrine webinar. This is the last class of this series. Today we are going to see what happened with these bodies that didn't have the incarnation of any of the celestial beings, and some other interesting aspects of the beginning of humanity. So we will start with Shloka 25, which is just a summary of the situation in which we are at the moment. It says, how did the Manasa, and remember Manas means mind, so Manasa are those endowed with a mind. How did the Manasa, the sons of wisdom, act? They rejected the self-born, the boneless. They are not ready. They spurned the first sweat-born. They are not quite ready. They would not enter the first egg-born. So this is a summary of the first three root races. The self-born are the first root race. The first sweat-born is the later second root race. And the first egg-born is the early third root race. So we are coming close to around the middle of the third root race, which is when incarnation happened. We already saw in the previous class the different possibilities that were there, the bodies with different degrees of development, also celestial beings that would be the soul of the bodies with different states of development too. And the process of incarnation, taking the bodies, begins around the middle of the third root race. Now we will explore now a special kind of incarnation, a special case, which Blavatsky says could be seen as a new creation, a fresh creation. The shloka says, when the sweat-born produced the egg-born, the twofold, the androgyne third race, the mighty, the powerful with bones, the lords of wisdom, said, now shall we create. So there is a new kind of character introduced here, the mighty, the powerful with bones, and Blavatsky calls them the lords of wisdom. In general, we have seen that Blavatsky uses the term sons of wisdom. Now she's using lords of wisdom. Unfortunately, she doesn't use these terms in a very systematic way. Remember that she's translating all these shlokas from some foreign language, probably from Stanza, which is an unknown language. We have some reference to her having studied Stanza during her training in Tibet. And the shlokas are also translated into Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, according to what Blavatsky said, but she didn't know any of those languages. She was familiar with them, but not enough to translate from there. So probably she's translating from this old language. And in the process of translating, she had to create the English terms, and she was not very systematic with that. So we will find that she goes back and forth between calling these beings sons of wisdom or lords of wisdom. I think for us to keep this idea clearer, as we talk about this particular instance, keep in mind that these are higher beings. These are lords of wisdom, even if Blavatsky sometimes may refer to them as son of wisdom. So the idea is that here there is this group of higher beings that say once the third root race gets to a point before the separation of sexes, they say, now we shall create. Then the next shloka says, the third race became the vahan, or vehicle, of the lords of wisdom. It created sons of will and yoga by Kriya Shakti. It created them, the Holy Fathers, ancestors of the Arhats. So let's see what that means. Blavatsky says in the first or earlier portion of existence of this third race, while it was yet in a state of purity, the sons of wisdom, it would be here lords of wisdom, as will be seen, incarnated in this third race. Clearly, the lords of wisdom are the Kumaras of the Hindu pantheon. The Kumaras, explained an esoteric text, are the Dhyanis derived from the Supreme Principle who reappear in the Vaivasvata Manu period for the progress of mankind. So she sometimes refers to these Kumaras. We saw this briefly in some of the other classes. In the Hindu mythology, the Kumaras are regarded to be an eighth creation, and they are gods that were asked to create, to incarnate as human beings, and they refused doing that. The traditional Hindu view is that they did it because they wanted to remain chaste, and Kumara means young, so they wanted to be spiritual entities beyond the passing of time and age, and meditating in a pure state. So these are the gods that refused to create. Now, this esoteric text from which Blavatsky is quoting, she doesn't give the source. She says that these Kumaras are the first emanation from the Supreme Principle. That means the first emanations are always the highest from the point of view of the esoteric philosophy. So these are the first emanations, and they reappear, she says, in the Vaivasvata Manu period. Vaivasvata is the name of the Manu of the fifth root race in the Theosophical literature. The Manu is this celestial being. He is a high Mahatma or Arhat who is in charge of the fifth root race. But then there is another Vaivasvata Manu, which is in charge of the round. So since we are talking here about the third root race, we are probably referring here to this other higher, so to say, Vaivasvata Manu. So you have to keep that in mind, not to confuse the two that for some reason have the same name. But basically the idea is that the Manu is the one that is in charge of a particular cycle of evolution. So being in the fourth round, this Manu is in charge of the whole round, and then the Kumaras incarnate in this round to help the progress of mankind. Now, Blavatsky says, how did they create, since the lords of wisdom are identical with the Hindu devas who refused to create? Remember, we said also that the highest dhyanis, they don't have the physical fire of creation, in the sense that because they don't have a lower nature, they don't have a physical nature, they cannot work on the lower planes, or normally in their activity they don't descend to the lower planes. They remain working their life and experiences and work are all on the higher planes. So how did they manage to create on the physical plane? Blavatsky says that the power by which they first created is Kriya Shakti. Remember, this was mentioned in the shloka. That mysterious and divine power latent in the will of every man, and which, if not called to life, quickened and developed by yogi training, remains dormant and gets atrophied. So the idea is that this Kriya Shakti is a power described in Hinduism, which we could translate as the power of thought. As Blavatsky says, because human beings are an emanation of the creative hierarchies, human beings have creative powers. We know about our creative power on the physical plane, just producing offspring. We know about our creative power on the psychological plane, so to say, artistic creativity or scientific creativity on the emotional, the mental levels. But there are also spiritual creative powers, so to say, which are latent in us. At this point in evolution, we have not developed them. It took a long time to develop the powers of emotional and intellectual creativity in humanity. The powers of spiritual creativity are not yet awakened. With what Blavatsky calls here yogi training, that power may be awakened. And there are different yogis, and even Blavatsky herself, who have this Kriya Shakti active. Blavatsky had many times materialized things in the front of many different witnesses in many different occasions, and people from different origins and levels of education. She materialized the teapot and then some flowers, and then many letters that came from the masters. So this power of Kriya Shakti is able to actually create physical forms. In some of her writings, Blavatsky explains one has to be able to generate a perfect image at the level of the mind, in all its details, visualizing the whole thing in all its detail, and then make that image more and more concrete, coming down until we get to the physical plane. And by using the willpower that is called Ija Shakti in Hinduism, and the Kriya Shakti, the power of our thought, we can attract the atoms, the material necessary to make physical that model that was created on the inner planes. And this, of course, requires a level of development that most people in humanity don't have at the moment. And that is a protection, because if most human beings could shape reality with their thoughts, then the world would be far more of a chaos than it is already. So the power of Kriya Shakti exists, but is not available or is not readily available to most human beings. The person needs a training that for the most part is beyond the current ability of most in humanity. So the Lords of Wisdom produced by Kriya Shakti a progeny called the Sons of Will and Yoga. So they actually created physical bodies on the physical plane that were going to serve as vehicles for themselves. So these high celestial beings, instead of occupying these bodies that nature had been developed, that were half ready, that some of them were better than others, they created these physical bodies that we may presume were far more perfect and far better for their own incarnation. And then they became, and this progeny, these physical bodies that were incarnated in the celestial beings were called the Sons of Will and Yoga, because the power that was used was a yogic power, so to say. And now these beings became the ancestors, the spiritual forefathers of all the subsequent and present Arhats or Mahatmas in a truly immaculate way. They were indeed created, not begotten, as were their brethren of the fourth race, who were generated sexually after the separation of sexes, the fall of man, the fall into generation. So these Sons of Will and Yoga, who were probably a relatively small population of bodies created through Kriya Shakti and with high celestial beings incarnated in them. This population are the spiritual forefathers of all the masters of wisdom that would come later. We will see that more in detail. So Blavatsky says it was not a race, this progeny. It was at first a wondrous being called the initiator. So at first, according to Blavatsky, there was one being, one wondrous being that incarnated, who is called the initiator. And after him, she says, a group of semi-divine and semi-human beings. These other higher celestial beings incarnated after the initiator. They were set apart in the archaic Genesis for certain purposes. They are those in whom are said to have incarnated the highest dhyanis, celestial beings, munis and rishis from previous manvantaras, from previous evolutionary cycles, to form the nursery for future human adepts on this earth and during the present cycle. So they are the nursery for human adepts. Because human evolution is just starting at this point, humanity could not produce adepts, or the earth humanity could not produce adepts right away. As we have seen, those bodies in which the celestial beings who would become the souls of the bodies incarnated fully were already monads that had almost accomplished in previous evolutionary cycles the human experience. So in relatively few generations, they became adepts on Earth. But until that happened, then these celestial beings who evolved in previous evolutionary cycles, in previous or in different planets, they came to Earth spiritually, not through a UFO. They came spiritually on the inner planes, and then they incarnated, and they acted as the fathers, the spiritual fathers of humanity. The physical fathers of humanity were the Pitris, Parhishats, that created the physical bodies. We could say that the intellectual fathers or parents, say, of humanity were these Anishwatas, the dhyanis that incarnated in the or emanated the spark into the bodies. But these, Blavatsky says, are the spiritual fathers, because they are the ones that generated in humanity the seed for what today we call the brotherhood of adepts. So we can see that the adepts were with humanity from the very beginning. And whatever their origin, whatever the source of the evolution for those monads, but since the beginning of humanity, we had some adepts. So Blavatsky says, these sons of will and yoga, born, so to speak, in an immaculate way, remained, it is explained, entirely apart from the rest of mankind. So this first group, these sons of will and yoga, remained apart from humanity, and probably most of their work had to do with a few individuals, those who would become adepts in a few generations in the future. So Blavatsky says, the far distant predecessors of Gautama the Buddha, once living men, great adepts and saints, in whom the sons of wisdom had incarnated, 11 only belonged to the Atlantean race. The Atlantean race was the fourth root race, after this third one, where the incarnation of the celestial beings happened, and before our current root race, that is the fifth one. So 11 belong to the Atlantean race and 24 to the fifth race from its beginnings. They are identical with the Tirthankaras of the Jains. So here it's interesting to see some numbers, whether these are allegorical numbers or actual numbers, we don't know. But it seems that during the Atlantean race, only 11 of the human beings that had incarnated, or these celestial beings that had incarnated on Earth as a human, only 11 of them attained the degree of adeptship during the fourth root race, and 24 attained that degree of adeptship during the fifth root race. So these were the successors in a sense, or of the first adepts that were these sons of the sons of will and yoga. Remember, these sons of will and yoga, we, for the sake of differentiating them, we could say they are not human adepts. The first human adepts are the ones that attained adeptship within the human evolution here on Earth. So only 11 of them attained that degree in the fourth root race and 24 in the fifth root race, according to the numbers that Blavatsky gives. But these were all guided by the sons of will and yoga. Now let's go back to this first wondrous being. Blavatsky says that he's the root base of the highest hierarchy on our terrestrial chain of the Brotherhood of Adepts. This wondrous being descended from a high region, they say, in the early part of the third age, before the separation of the sexes of the third race. He is the initiator, called the Great Sacrifice. For sitting at the threshold of light, he looks into it from within the circle of darkness, which he will not cross, nor will he quit his post till the last day of this life cycle. So the idea here is that this being, the initiator, is the highest being in the whole planetary chain, in the whole Earth chain. This and the way Blavatsky talks about him, and of course we say he or she, this celestial being is beyond any gender, but let's talk about in the traditional way. He really belongs to the higher planes of the planetary chain. Remember that when we talked about the planetary chain formed of 7 globes, these 7 globes take place or are positioned within the 4 lower planes of in the solar system. Now, this wondrous being belongs to the higher planes, through the 3 higher planes of which we cannot make any image or understand anything about, Blavatsky says, because these planes are so far beyond our understanding. And yet, this being decides to come down to the lower planes and remain in the darkness just to watch over the development of humanity. He is sometimes called the silent watcher. He is the ultimate consciousness that is embracing the evolution of the planetary change of the whole Earth. And he's also the initiator because during the process of occult initiation, not the initiations in different organizations or religions, but the occult initiations that happen on the inner planes, initiations that happen more to the soul than to the body, to the personality. He is the source of, let's say, the spiritual energy that comes to the initiate during the ceremonies that take place on the inner planes. And he will remain there until the whole evolution on Earth is over. So Blavatsky explains a little more and says it is under the direct, silent guidance of this Maha, great Guru, that all the other less divine teachers and instructors of mankind became, from the first awakening of human consciousness, the guides of early humanity. So he was the head of all these divine teachers and instructors. It is through these sons of God, through these instructors, that infant humanity got its first notions of all the arts and sciences, as well as of spiritual knowledge, and it is they who have laid the first foundation stone of those ancient civilizations that puzzle so sorely our modern generation of students and scholars. As we are going to discuss by the end of this class, the picture that the esoteric philosophy presents is that humanity was never left alone. Humanity was always guided, that the learning of the early civilizations in astronomy, medicine, mathematics, architecture, agriculture, all these things were actually taught to humanity. From this point of view, we did not came upon this knowledge just randomly by trial and error when the mind of mankind was still developing. That would have taken many, many more millions of years than it took otherwise for mankind to come to the place where we are at right now. So in the same way that a child is born within a family and parents who guide him or her, and he's not just left alone to develop however he or she can, in a similar way, humanity is guided by spiritual parents, if we want to put it that way, so that they can accelerate the process of learning and evolution of humanity. So all these ancient civilizations, not only in Egypt with their pyramids, but also the Easter Island and in Peru, all that civilizations that the Incas inherited, because they inherited that a big civilization. They were not the ones that developed it. All these were, and many others were generated by, or were the human beings at the time were guided by these sons of God, these early adepts, so that they could evolve in a faster way. And then Blavatsky quotes the following: "When we have ascertained the extent of the universe and learned to know all that there is in it, we will multiply our race," answer the sons of will and yoga. This means that the great adepts and initiated ascetics will multiply, that is, once more produce mind-born immaculate sons in the seventh root race. So what Blavatsky is saying here is that the gods are going to walk among men again in the seventh root race. We are in the fifth root race. The beginnings of the sixth root race are on its way, but we have still probably a couple of million years until the sixth root race is actually developed. And then that root race will evolve for some million years, and then we will come to the seventh root race. So this is far in the future. But at the point of the seventh root race, the general evolution of humanity will be such that will allow to have the adepts, the sons of God, to incarnate and be among us and teach us and guide us, not guide us about mundane things, but to guide us about how to discover the true nature of what we really are. So that happened at the beginning of human evolution, just to get us started, and it will happen again towards the end of human evolution on this globe, before we pass on to the next globe in the chain and continue our journey. So that is all that we have for that particular group of high divine beings that incarnated in bodies, specially generated. Now let's see, we have still one more issue to solve, which is what happened with these celestial beings that did not incarnate in humanity during the third root race, but they deferred the incarnation until the beginning of the fourth. So meanwhile, the shloka says the animals separated in the sexes first into male and female. And then the animals, began to breed in the sexual reproduction. Now, after the animals, the twofold men, the humans from the third root race, separated also. So they became male and female also. And men said, let us do as they do, let us unite and make creatures. They did. So this is the beginning of sexual reproduction in humanity. Now, all this, as we are going to see, took millions of years. So this, the way that this is explained here, again, is allegorical. But generally speaking, animals separated first, and then human beings, little by little, began to separate, and that's how the physical evolution in men and animals came down to the sexual reproduction. So Blavatsky summarizes again the whole process. She says the third race, almost sexless in its early beginnings, became bisexual or androgynous very gradually, of course. The passage from the former, from the androgynous state, from the bisexual state, to the latter, to the separation of sexes, require numberless generations. The third race humanity began to separate in their prenatal shells or eggs. Remember, we are in the transition from the human beings being born from eggs into human beings being born from the womb. So already the transition, the separation between sexes began during the stage of the egg-born, and then to issue out of them as distinct male and female babies, ages after the appearance of its early progenitors. So all this took a long time. As time rolled on its geological periods, the newly born subraces in the third root race began to lose their natal capacities. By the end of the fifth subrace, mankind was born under the same conditions and by the same identical process as our historical generations. This required, of course, millions of years. So Blavatsky says, as we have seen, that the incarnation of the celestial beings began 18 million years ago. This is more or less around the third root race, the third subrace of the third root race. And then she says that by the end of the fifth subrace, so the fourth and the fifth ran their course, and before the sixth subrace began, then the process of generation and birth was already established in the same way that we have it today. And that, of course, she says, require millions of years. So she says that up to this point, to the point in which humanity becomes physical, the sexes are separated, reproduction becomes sexual, up to this point, the evolution of man belongs more to the metaphysical than the physical nature. Most of the evolution took place on the inner planes. It is only after the so-called fall that the races began to develop rapidly into a purely human shape. So during this transition from non-physical into physical beings, there was a lot of variety, as we are going to see a little about. the evolution, the physical evolution, was trying to settle into a physical form, into a physical mode of reproduction. And in between, there were many intermediate species, if we want to put it that way, or even forms. Within what we call the human kingdom, there were many variations. And little by little, humanity came to a more stable form. And that's when we can start talking about physical evolution, properly speaking. So when the animals separated, what we read, humans said, let us do as they do, let us unite and make creatures. They did. Now the next shloka, and those who had no spark, the narrow-brained, took huge she-animals unto them. So when the human beings began to reproduce sexually, there were these human forms, remember, that had no real souls incarnated in them, because the celestial beings had refused to do so, to incarnate. And these human forms, which were human because they were forms meant for these celestial beings, they were forms in which their fourth principle, the kamic principle, was already evolved enough to receive the mind. And there was also manas as a principle was also activated to some degree. So they were human forms, but because they didn't have this what we call in Theosophy now the higher ego to guide them to stimulate that potential intelligence, they behaved more like animals. And then they began to reproduce with some animal's form. Remember, this is all at a very early period where human forms and animal forms were not all that different, when the genetic barriers that separate species were not there yet. This is all a transitional period. So they begat, the shloka says, upon them dumb races. Dumb they were, the narrow-brained themselves, but their tongues untied. So these narrow-brained eventually developed some kind of language. Not at this point, there was no language, this is very early. But the tongues of their progeny remained still. Monsters they bred, a race of crooked, red hair-covered monsters going on all fours. A dumb race to keep the shame untold. So there is this idea that out of the offspring of these mindless human forms and animals produce this race of red hair covered monsters, the shloka says, which were quite aggressive, and eventually they were eliminated. So from there, probably there were several lines of evolution that came out of these monsters and of this mixed offspring between human forms and animal forms. But some of them were these red hair covered monsters. So Blavatsky says, bear in mind that at that period, men were different, even physiologically, from what they are now, and animals certainly were as different from any we know now as were the men. So this is what I was saying, it's all a very early period. So Blavatsky explains the problem is that they had separated into sexes, these human forms, before the ray of divine reason had enlightened the dark region of their hitherto slumbering minds and had sinned. So the idea was that the celestial beings would incarnate before the separation of sexes, or during this transitional period in which sexes began to be separated. Some of the progeny of human progeny would at first the one gender would begin to be more dominant than the other when they were still bisexual, and little by little one of the genders would disappear from the different individuals, until there was only one gender in each body, as it is with most human beings today. So this was a long time. During that period is when the Dhyanis should incarnate. Once the sexes were separated and sexual reproduction began, these forms that had no higher egos to enlighten the latent mind produced this unnatural effect. So they sinned, Blavatsky says, that is to say, had committed evil unconsciously by producing an effect which was unnatural. So this was all something unconscious because the forms didn't have intelligence. This was the first physical fall into matter of some of the then existing and lower races. Now the sin of the brainless or mindless races, Blavatsky says, who had no spark and were irresponsible, fell upon those who failed to do by them their karmic duty. So of course the forms were mindless. They did produce unnatural results. They did degrade or degenerated lines of evolutions. But that is not their fault because they didn't have intelligence. So karmically, the responsibility fell upon those celestial beings, those souls who had refused to incarnate. So Blavatsky says this is how the commentary explains the details that preceded the fall. In the initial period of man's fourth evolution, and that fourth evolution, we could say the evolution in the fourth round, in the fourth globe, which is when all this is happening, the human kingdom branched off in several and various directions. The outward shape of its first specimens was not uniform. For the vehicles, the egg-like external shells in which the future fully physical man gestated were often tampered with before they hardened by huge animals of species now unknown and which belonged to the tentative efforts of nature. So there are several interesting things here. When humans were still developing in eggs, it seems that the forms were far more malleable at the time, and they were not so set, so physical, so hard in a sense as they are right now. Maybe they didn't even have bones in the way that we do. Maybe they have more like cartilage or something like that. So animals would tamper with the eggs, and the forms that came out of the eggs would be deformed, or there weren't really steady conditions for the development of the human beings. There were these huge animals, which the commentary here says belong to tentative efforts of nature. Physical evolution was always has this unconscious, so to say, tendency to produce a human form. But unless the Pitris Barhishats, who have intelligence, are there to kind of guide this physical evolution through the models that they emanated from them, unless they are there, nature cannot really produce a fit vessel for the celestial beings that we call a human being. So nature did produce different animals, but none of them were good enough. There is a shloka that we didn't introduce here early, before the second volume begins to really talk about human beings, that says nature unaided fails. So nature did try to produce these human beings, but they failed and they were not good enough, and eventually they were destroyed for that reason. So the result of all this chaotic beginning was that intermediate races of monsters, half animals, half men, were produced. But as they were failures, they were not allowed to breathe long and live, though the intrinsically paramount power of psychic over physical nature being yet very weak and hardly established, the egg-born sons had taken several of their females unto themselves as mates and bred other human monsters. So before the power of the psychic or the intellectual or the mental, before the power of the mind was stronger than the physical nature, all this uneven intercourse happened, or mixed intercourse happened. Later, the commentary says, animal species and human races becoming gradually equilibrized, they separated and made it no longer. Upon seeing this state of things, the kings and lords of the last races, of the third and the beginning of the fourth, placed the seal of prohibition upon the sinful intercourse. It interfered with karma. It developed new karma. So they, the divine kings, struck the culprits with sterility. So you see here how there is a line or there is a hierarchy of adepts that are led by what is called the Manu. We saw the Manu mentioned before, who are in charge of the physical human evolution. Perhaps in a similar way that we today, as human beings, we are able to to manipulate physical evolution to produce, for example, different breeds of dogs, or in the laboratory to produce certain kind of bacteria able to do certain things. This is called artificial evolution. So we have learned how to do this with animals, with plants, with bacteria. So probably these adepts were part of their work was to do something similar with the early human forms. So you see that human evolution, from this point of view, always happens within the context of an intelligence guiding it. For example, the intelligence may be a celestial being on the inner planes, maybe lower celestial beings on the physical plane, but not physical, more subtle, more ethereal, or maybe incarnated celestial beings. But the whole process of evolution, because it is so complex, so chaotic, so many possibilities, the whole process of evolution is guided by intelligences. It's no wonder that most scientists would say that life is a miracle. That is the first thing I learned in college during my scientific career, that most scientists say what happened on Earth is really a miracle. If you see if you think that things happen randomly, the fact that we came to what the world is today is unfathomable. It's impossible to conceive if you think that this happened randomly. So obviously some intelligence is needed behind, and this is what the esoteric philosophy proposes. So these monsters that were generated with this mixed intercourse, in these red-haired and hair-covered monsters, the fruit of the unnatural connection between men and animals, the lords of wisdom did not incarnate, as we see. Thus, so they were this progeny, half man and half animal, kept on reproducing on themselves, like with animals. They were basically animals, but they had human features also. So thus, by a long series of transformations, due to a natural crossbreeding originated in due course of time, the lowest specimens of humanity, while further bestiality and the fruit of the first animal efforts of reproduction begat a species which developed into mammalian apes, ages later. So this is interesting too. Blavatsky explains here that some of these mindless forms produced bodies that were used by the lower human monads, the monads that had just came out of the animal kingdom. We saw this already in the previous class. But also, in the case of some of these progeny, they served as a form for monads that are not quite human, but they were close to the end of the animal evolution. These monads are what today we call the apes. So in Blavatsky's view, the apes are like half humans. The apes, it's not that humanity came out of the apes, it is the opposite. The apes came out of the human forms by this kind of mixed breeding. And the monads that are there are monads that Blavatsky suggests, as we saw in a previous class, that they may become human beings in the next round of evolution. Very primitive early human beings in the next round of evolution. It is interesting to see that apes actually so far are the only animals that are able to learn sign language. And scientists have been able to have quite intelligent conversations with some apes. So you can definitely see there are some experiments that show that the apes have some self-consciousness, which is a typical quality of manas, of the mind. So you can see how apes are in the process of becoming human beings, perhaps the only animals that are in the process of becoming human beings. As we saw previously, at this point in evolution, if an animal monad comes to the point of being able to be a human being, they wait until those monads have to wait until a new planet with a new evolution to incarnate as humans. But the apes seem to be a special case, which in the next round may incarnate as actual humans. Now, this is a kind of mystery. Blavatsky was not very clear, of course, on this. So this is the impression that one gets from what Blavatsky says. And then when the third separated and fell into sin by breeding men animals, the animals became ferocious, and men and they mutually destructive. Till then, there was no sin, no life taken. So it seems that it is at this point that the things changed, and as the shloka says there, or the commentary, animals became ferocious, and then probably it was the beginning of carnivores, for example. Before then, no life was taken. I don't know if that means that all animals were herbivores, or maybe because they were not quite physical, they didn't need to eat yet. But certainly after this happened, then violence came into place between animals and humans. So the shlokas go on and say, seeing which the sin committed with the animals, the last, that's a Tibetan word for spirit, the sons of wisdom, who had not built men, who had refused to create, wept, saying, the Amanasa, the mindless, have defiled our future abodes. This is karma. Let us dwell in the others, let us teach them better, lest worse should happen. They did, and then all became endowed with manas, minds. They saw the sin of the mindless. So this group of celestial beings regarded the forms available to them not very evolved, not pleasing. So they thought, let's nature go on evolving these forms, until they are a little better, and then we will incarnate. Now, this happened that the forms, the mindless, produced these half animals, half monsters. But also something else happened, that these forms didn't keep on evolving. On the contrary, they began to degenerate, to go back to the animal state. And that is because, as we are going to see, there was no direction behind for the evolution. So Blavatsky says, for the first 3.5 root races, up to the middle or turning point, it is the astral shadows of the progenitors, the lunar Pitris, the Barhishat Pitris, which are the formative powers in the races, and which build and gradually force the evolution of the physical forms towards perfection. This at the cost of a proportionate loss of spirituality. So up to the point where the souls were supposed to incarnate, as I explained, the Pitris were pushing human evolution or evolution into the right direction. Now, once they attained or they came to this point in evolution, once the Pitris came to this point in evolution, their job was gone, and then they go back to the inner planes, to their own abodes, as we saw in a previous shloka. So then, Blavatsky says, from this point, from this turning point, it is the higher ego, or the incarnating principle, the nous or mind, which reigns over the animal ego and rules it whenever it is not carried down by the latter. So once the soul incarnates, it is the soul the one that becomes the evolving power in the form. So the Pitris are like the parents, really like parents. They take care of the human forms until the souls can take care of those human forms. So these forms that were left with no souls, because the Pitris had retired, they began to degenerate. So when all this happened, that they began to degenerate, they bred into all these monsters that produced more karmic difficulties. Then these celestial beings wept, as the shloka says, and said, let us incarnate now before things get worse. But then they incarnated in worse forms than otherwise would have been the case if they had incarnated when they should. And that produced a problem for them. A problem because those personalities were not receptive to the spiritual, were far more insensitive to the spiritual efforts of the soul. And they developed into, Blavatsky says, rebellious human beings. A few of them became black magicians in the future. So as the shloka says in the first volume, they suffer and they caused suffering. Blavatsky says, no sooner had the mental eye of man been opened to understanding than the third race felt itself one with the ever-present as the ever-to-be-unknown and indivisible all, the one universal deity. Endowed with divine powers and feeling in himself his inner God, each felt he was a man-god in his nature, though an animal in his physical self. So now she talks about the third root race in which the celestial beings had incarnated. The third root race was still quite spiritual. Remember in the previous, this addresses what Blavatsky says in the last sentence in the previous slide, or here in the previous paragraph, that the physical forms began to go towards perfection, this at the cost of a proportionate loss of spirituality. The idea is that at the beginning, forms were quite spiritual, quite transparent, so to say, to the spiritual planes, because they were not as dense, material as they would become later. So at the very beginning, the subtle physical forms did not block the perception of spirituality. As and the evolution proceeded into the fourth root race, which was the most material of all, then all that was gradually lost. But in the perception, the consciousness of the third root race, they all felt naturally at one, as one with everything around. They all felt the divine presence of the soul. So they just, as Blavatsky says, didn't need any religion. She says, at the dawn of his consciousness, the man of the third root race had thus no beliefs that could be called religion. But if the term is to be defined as the binding together of the masses in one form of reverence paid to those we feel higher than ourselves, of piety as a feeling expressed by a child toward a loved parent, then even the earliest Lemurians, this third root race, had a religion, and a most beautiful one. Because they were still like children, they had this innate devotion and love for their leaders, their rulers, and for the gods within, and for the oneness around. They were a very innocent at the beginning and spiritual race. Blavatsky says it was the golden age in those days of old, the age when the gods walked the earth and mixed freely with the mortals. The struggle between the God within and the animal in man, the physical form, began from the very day they tasted of the fruit of the tree of wisdom, a struggle for life between the spiritual and the psychic and the physical. By psychic, she means the psychological, the mind, the emotions. So as soon as humanity acquired the mind, remember one of the shlokas said that the Dzyan is incarnated and intensify the kama, the passionate nature. So from that point on, the struggle between the animal and the spiritual began, and then humanity began to lose the spirituality. Those who conquer the lower principles by obtaining mastery over the body joined the sons of light. So those monads that were quite evolved, that incarnated in these bodies and that could overcome the tendency to become more material, they became adepts, as we said. But those who fell victims of their lower natures, because the monads were not so evolved, so this was something inevitable, they became the slaves of matter. From sons of light and wisdom, they ended by becoming sons of darkness. And darkness not in the sense of evil, just in the sense of spiritual darkness. So this is where we would stop when all the celestial beings incarnated. Let me just show you a few more slides about what happened next, but we will stop here basically. This process when humanity ate, as Blavatsky says, the fruit of the tree of wisdom, in the Bible it is said the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, which according to Blavatsky represents the acquisition of mind, the acquisition of the ability to recognize good and evil. Once this happened, then humanity was expelled from paradise, from Eden, from the Garden of Eden in the biblical mythology. So from Eden to exile, Blavatsky says the first two races had not to do with climate, nor were they subservient to any temperature or change the rain. So the first two races were not physical, remember. So climate, the weather didn't affect them. And thus we are taught men lived down to the close of the third root race, when eternal spring reigned over the whole globe. So during the third root race, there was an eternal spring. The third race, which inhabited the great Lemurian continent, preceded the veritable and complete human races, the fourth and the fifth. So as we have seen, the first truly human race could be said to be the fourth root race after this transitional period of the third. During the third, there was an eternal spring, things were just getting settled. But after that, after the separation, the Satya Yuga, the golden age, was at an end. The eternal spring became constant change and seasons succeeded. Cold forced men to build shelters and devise clothing. This is part of what stimulates the development of a mind or the development of abilities to fight against the environment to survive. So this all comes very in an organic way, all these changes in the planet and with humanity to serve the purpose of evolution. So the men appealed to the superior fathers, the higher gods or angels, these divine beings that were incarnated. They begged for help, allegorically speaking. The Nirmanakaya of the Nagas are sages, the wise serpents and dragons of light came, and the precursors of the enlightened Buddhas. Divine kings descended and taught men sciences and arts, for men could live no longer in the first land, the Eden of the first races, which had turned into a white frozen corpse. So this is around the ice ages that the earth went through. So at this point, when human beings were expelled from Eden, allegorically speaking, they were not left alone. These divine beings incarnated and they guided humanity. So the Lemuro-Atlanteans, the last part of Lemuria and the beginning of Atlantis, were the first who had a dynasty of spirit kings, or demigods or angels again, who had assumed bodies to rule over them, and who in their turn instructed them in arts and sciences. Under the guidance of their divine rulers, the last two sub-races of the third root race, the sixth and the seventh, built large cities, cultivated arts and sciences, and knew astronomy, architecture, and mathematics to perfection. This is Blavatsky. So this is where we are going to end this series. In the last two sub-races of the third root race, when the human body was more or less stable and the method of reproduction also, they began to be guided by these divine kings. They began to develop cities, culture, agriculture, etc. And that is how humanity got started on this planet.